and I would like to welcome you to another episode of The Charm of It, the podcast for knitters who share my fascination with the nitty-gritty details of our craft. If you're a returning viewer, it is so wonderful to see you again. And if you're a new viewer, I'm really glad that you found your way to my little corner of the internet. Today's podcast episode is going to be fairly short, just because I have other things I need to do this afternoon, unfortunately. But I will be talking about 2 finished objects, one of which I'm wearing. 2 works in progress, yes. And then I'll also be answering a viewer question about how I learned to knit. I know that I've talked about that on the podcast before, but I've been at this for almost 3 years now, and I think that was in a fairly early episode, so I don't think that repeating it now will be a big problem. Before I get into the knitting, I wanted to remind you all that the Here We Gnome Again Cal Knit Along is still happening. You have until September 4th to enter for prizes. Although obviously, if you just want to share the gnome love, you can check out that hashtag and use it anytime. I'm co-hosting with Sarah from the Imagine Landscapes podcast, and she's also the designer of the pattern. It's absolutely wonderful. I don't have a gnome to show you because I gave it away. So I will insert a photo from Sarah's pattern so that you can see it's full of cabley wonderfulness, and it's a really neat wonderful finished object. So I encourage you to enter, and if it works with both works in progress on Instagram and then finished objects both on Instagram and Ravelry. If you want to hear all the details about prizes and that kind of thing, head over to the Ravelry thread that is linked below in the Imagine Landscapes podcast group. Speaking of which, as I mentioned, that is an audio knitting podcast hosted by Sarah and Katie, who are 2 wonderful sisters who live in Canada and are just amazing. And I found their podcast last year and really fell in love with it. And then I kind of started connecting with Katie over Instagram, and then Sarah with the gnomes, and they invited me to be a guest on their podcast. So that was just a wonderful experience. They were so funny and gracious and smart, and I just felt really happy to be able to do that. So if you are interested in hearing that episode, it is currently available on, I think you can listen to it on their website as well as, of course, iTunes and that kind of thing. So I'll include a link to that below. And if you're not already listening to their podcast, you definitely should, because it's wonderful. I am going to try to figure out the technology so that Sarah and Katie can also guests on my podcast. So hopefully I'll manage to figure that out. But in the meantime, you can go listen to that episode. I felt it was such a fangirl moment for me. So yeah, it was really fun. And I believe that is all the administrative things that I need to talk about. Okay. Oop, the sun is coming out. At least it's cooled off today. We've been in the middle of a terrible heat wave, but I was determined to finish the sweater by today because today was the only cool day, and I wanted to wear it. I figured dress for the season you want, not the season you have. First, I will talk about my simple finished object, and that is a vivid blanket square. I know that I mentioned this way back in the beginning of the year that I wanted to knit this blanket, and I have actually been working on it ever since, and this is the new square, but it doesn't look that good because it's unblocked. So this is what it looks like when it's been blocked and then folded and thrown in a basket forever. But yeah, so obviously the vivid blanket is a pattern that is knit in squares, and then you join them at the end, which I really like because I don't like having a lot of weight on my wrists if I can help it, and I really enjoy seaming things. So hopefully that will work for me. I think I'm at about 20 squares now, so this has been a really nice project for me just because I keep everything I need to knit a square in one project bag, and whenever I want to knit but I'm not sure what I want to knit, or if I need a break from fingering weight yarn because I'm knitting this in Aran weight, then I just pick it up and knit a square or 2, and then I'm really happy. So I'm not so much worried about the end product on this one, although I'll be really happy when I finally have a blanket. But it's definitely more of a process knit for me. And the yarn was gifted to me. This is Debbie Bliss Cashmerino Aran it's a mauve, but I don't know what the actual color name is. So I have it in this mauve and then a chocolate brown. And then the same knitter gifted me Cascade Aran Superwash in a cream color. So those are the three colors that I'm using for the blanket. I have 900 yards each of the mauve and chocolate and like 1800 yards of the cream. So I don't expect to use all of that in one blanket, but we'll see. Maybe it just needs to be a gigantic blanket. And my color's getting a little washed out. It's actually almost identical to my bedspread behind there. If you're a new viewer, I live in a studio apartment, and that's the wall with the windows, so that's why you get my bed as a background. Anyway, yeah, so that was just my kind of relaxing finished object, because I realized that I hadn't finished anything since the very beginning of the month, and so I wanted that kind of rush of satisfaction. And I've pretty much got the pattern memorized at this point, so it's nice. And my other finished object is my Autumn in the Shire cardigan, which I talked about swatching for last time. Oh, excuse me. So this is out of Knit Pick Stroll Tweed in the Garnet Heather colorway. And it's a little darker because I think my camera is showing a little overexposed, but it's just the most beautiful burgundy color. And the tweed flecks are kind of black and tan and cream, I would say. And I designed this sweater myself, so it's mainly stockinette, the body of the sweater. Both the fronts and backs are stockinette. The waistband, which you cannot see, I'm going to insert photos, and the button band and neckband and sleeves are all in double moss, which I'm pretty sure is called something different in the UK, but I keep forgetting to check what. So essentially, if you were going to chart it, so if you're only looking at the right side row, it's 2 knit, 2 purl, 2 knit, 2 purl, and then 2 purl, 2 knit, 2 purl, 2 knit. So it's a 4x4 kind of pattern repeat. And I thought that it looked really nice in the tweed yarn and didn't take away from the tweediness. And I'm really glad that I decided to do the sleeves in the full texture because I really like the little addition that adds. I also did pleats on the sleeve, just very small ones. And they're in the center of the sleeve cap, so I don't know why they're sitting back. I don't know if that's my anatomy or if that's how all sweaters work. Next time I would probably put it maybe a little more towards the front. And what else? I added I-cord for the cuffs because I like having a sleeve with a cuff that is different. But of course with the double moss stitch, you can just do the cuff and the sleeve in the same. So I did an I-cord cast on and then an applied I-cord edging just to kind of delineate the cuff. And obviously I did 3/4 length sleeves, which when I bend my elbows seem a little shorter, but I really like this length because it lets me not overheat. I think it's in the high 60s today, so that is what, around 17 Celsius? I disgraced myself by doing math completely wrong, converting Fahrenheit to Celsius on the Imagine Landscapes podcast the other day. But usually I can do it pretty well. Anyway, yeah, so that's why I chose to do 3/4 length sleeves. I did a crew neck because that is just the kind of sweater that I wear the most. And it's cropped also, like every other sweater that I have knit and wore a lot. And here's what it looks like buttoned up. I'm going to insert photos. I just took some, so I know that I'll have them to put in. And these buttons I got from an Etsy seller. I can't remember which one. If I don't have if I don't have buttons in my stash that work when I finished a cardigan, I make sure to order like 2 or 3 sets from an Etsy seller because that way it kind of distributes that shipping cost around. So. I was also debating between doing a lighter wooden button, and the people, all my friends on Instagram who were helping me pick between buttons also were torn. And the lighter button really picked up the tweed, but unfortunately once I started to sew them on, they just dominated the sweater, and so you didn't notice the texture anymore because, I mean, it's a pretty subtle detail. And it was just getting completely dominated by the row of buttons. So I sewed on 3 and decided that they were too high contrast. So I did take a dorky photo that I will insert here so that you can see what I mean. Please ignore my face. And I went with the lower contrast option, but these still have a cute little stitching detail, so really like them. So this sweater for me was an experiment in fit, because my body has been changing a little bit this year, and then I've become even more particular about how sweaters fit, so I've been noticing issues with some of my older sweaters, what I like about them, what I don't like about them. And so I kind of tried to distill all of that into knitting this sweater. And the reason why I chose to knit this sweater as a practice is because it was mainly stockinette, so I didn't have to worry about fitting in a pattern. I could just do things solely for fit and see what happened. Also, since it's Knit Pick Stroll and I got it during the summer sale, it was very affordable. This was a $15 sweater, so it wasn't going to break my heart if it ended up not fitting perfectly, and for some reason I didn't want to rip it out. The first thing I did that's different from other sweaters that I've knit is I decided, in the past, I would decide how wide I wanted it at the bust and then divide that measurement in half and knit the back to that half and the fronts also to that half, taking out the 1 inch for the button band. So let's say I wanted a 35-inch around sweater. I would knit the back piece to be 17.5 inches and each front piece to be 8.25 inches. And then the extra inch would come from the button band. This time I decided basically to add an inch of ease to just the front by not worrying about the button band. So I do actually think that I was aiming for this to be around 35 inches, so that there would be 0 ease at my bust. And so I knit the back piece to 17 inches. I knit both the front pieces to 8.5 inches, and then I went ahead and knit the inch button band, and that gave me the final 35-inch measurement. So basically there's more fabric at the front of the sweater than there is at the back. And I thought that that made sense because even though I don't have a very generous chest compared to a lot of women, there's certainly enough of it that there's more of me in the front than the back. And I think that that really helped with the button band. This button band does not gape at all. I did use some other tricks that I've picked up while knitting button bands to also try to stop that, but I think that having that kind of extra ease right there is really nice. Now, I did take into account the 1 inch button band when I was knitting the waist, since I like a snug waistband. So on the fronts, I knit them 1/2 inch smaller than I would have if it were a pullover. But then, so I ended up doing more increases on the front than the back for the waist to chest increase. It's not your chest when it's the back, is it? I guess the waist shaping. And I think that that worked out really well. The only thing I've noticed is, so I wear my cardigans like this a lot. You can't see it, but it's buttoned at the waistband. And most of the ones when I wear them like this, they do this kind of framey thing. And this one, because it has extra fabric in the front, I can certainly make it do that, but you saw that it wants to sit a little closer. That doesn't bother me. It's just the only other difference that I noticed as far as behavior went. Let's see, what else? I did quite a narrow neckband just because I like having a little bit of a lower, wider neckband. I like my collarbones to show when I've buttoned that top button. And so I had started the bind off for the crew neck a little bit higher, perhaps, than I should have if I wanted a big run band. But the other thing too is that, so when you're knitting a neckband out of stitches other than ribbing, which draws in, you have to decrease as you knit. And the bigger the band, the more decreases you have to put in, because the smaller, in comparison, essentially you're knitting a donut, right? And so the inside of the donut, that ring, has a much smaller circumference than the outside of the donut. And so that's why you have to decrease, and the bigger that neckband is, the smaller that inner circumference is, essentially. So, like, I hope that makes sense. And so I knew that I wanted to have a fairly small neckband because double moss stitch is a 4-stitch repeat, and so I didn't want to have to worry about doing a bunch of decrease rows to keep that in pattern. So it was partly planned and also partly just because I was kind of making it up as I went and measuring from the arm side. Speaking of which, I did a 7.5 inch arm side, and I really love how it fits. This is still easy for me to layer over sleeved things, but I think it looks really neat and tailored. and I absolutely love that. I'm going to make sure that I don't go any longer than 7.5 inches in any of my future sweaters. I mentioned that it's easy to layer, and I think that's partly because I added more positive ease in the sleeve than I used to, and that was mainly because it's a 4-stitch repeat, and so I had to pick between a little more snug than I would usually go or a little bigger than I would usually go. So I ended up at 90 stitches for the sleeve. I was knitting this at 7.5 stitches to the inch. So that makes it what? About 12 inches, although you lose 2 stitches for the selvage. And I think my bicep is 10.5 inches. So that's like, it looks like it's about 2 inches of positive ease when I pinch it. And I would have thought that that would look sloppy, but I really don't think it does. I think it looks very nice and neat, and it makes layering so much simpler. One of the dresses that I plan to wear this with in the fall and winter has little sleeves, so I really wanted to make sure that there would be space for those, and I wouldn't have to be like fighting with it a lot. I also think that the pleat helps because in order to have that extra fabric for the pleat, you do fewer decreases on the sleeve cap than you would otherwise, so there's a little more space in here, and then it all gets taken in at the top. So that also just helps add a little bit of extra room there. And yeah, I did knit the sleeves flat and seam them, which is not something I usually do. Usually I knit the body in pieces and seam that, and then I knit the sleeves in the round to the sleeve cap, and then knit that flat and seam just the sleeve cap in. However, with double moss stitch, it's identical on the back and front, so it would be the exact same kind of knitting, no matter which way I did it. And since this is a superwash yarn, which I haven't knit with before, and I've heard that superwash yarn can stretch a lot, I thought that having seams everywhere there could be wouldn't be a bad idea. So, and it actually made it easier to increase in pattern. Oh, I forgot to take a photo of my seam here. We'll just do that. That's nice and stylish, right? So when you're knitting in the round and you're trying to do increases for your sleeve, usually you need at least 1 stitch between them. But since I was knitting it flat, I could do the sleeve, the increases right on the edge. I mean, there was the selvage stitch, but that was it. And that made it a lot easier to increase in pattern because double moss stitch is a 4-stitch repeat, and so that way they're touching each other, so there's not anything in between. Does that make sense? If I had kept like a column of 2 like knit in pattern and double moss and then been increasing off that, I would have had to increase 8 full stitches to keep the pattern going. Whereas since I could increase right next to each other, I was in pattern every 4 stitches that I increased, and since you increase 2 on each round, that's every 2 increase rounds. So it was a lot easier to increase in pattern than I expected. That's all that was about. And all I did was, if I was increasing, I made sure that all of the body was still in pattern, and then let's say that I was about to start doing a purl 2, so my increase would be a knit 1. And then I just knit that the same, but it was essentially a column of seed stitch versus a column of moss. And I also did the same thing on the neckband when I had to decrease. I just decreased a pair, so the double moss, into 1, and then just kept knitting that, knit 2, purl 2, that kind of thing. And I think it blends in really well. I guess I will tell you a little bit of more detail about the buttonhole, and then I will finally move on to other things. For both the neckband, the buttonhole band, and the button band, I went down 4 needle sizes. Usually I go down 2 needle sizes, but once again, because it's superwash, I didn't quite trust it. So I knit the body on a size 1.5, and I knit the bands on size 000s, which I really don't like using 000s. They hurt my hands. But, you know, at least all of these are fairly small amounts of knitting, so it went fairly quickly. And I did that mainly because, as I said, I wanted to make sure that there would be a lot of structure. If your neckband starts to stretch out, then your shoulders stop fitting because it starts doing this. And so it's really important to get a nice, snug, sturdy neckband. especially with a cardigan where you don't have to worry about pulling it over your head. So for the button bands, if I'm only going down 2 needle sizes, then I usually only pick up 1 stitch for every 2 rows, just because my knitting, I tend to knit hobbit stitches. They tend to be quite short, and so my row to stitch gauge, I've got more rows than some knitters. But because I was using the 000s and I had already picked up along the neckband and that looked really good, I went ahead and picked up 2 stitches for every 3 rows. And that worked out really well. I haven't blocked this yet, but as you can see, there's no puckering, but there's also, it's not trying to grow longer. I only did 1 for 2 up here on the neckband because that was at a smaller gauge. So for the buttonholes, I used Pam Allen's double yarn over buttonhole, which I will link to the directions. However, where she does 1 decrease for the directions, I do 2. And that also worked out really well in the double moss stitch. And the reason I do that is because, in my experience, once you've buttoned the hole, it stretches out, and it doesn't ever really go back to as small as it used to be. And in my experience, it stretches out at least 2 stitches worth. So if you have that yarn over plus another stitch, then that means that the buttonhole band slowly lengthens as it gets stretched out. And so I've just had issues with that in the past, and I have found that doing 2 decreases for each buttonhole instead of 1 helps kind of eliminate some of that. And so once the buttonhole is complete, it's a 3-row buttonhole process. Then I increase back to my original stitch count. And the only other thing, which I mentioned shoulders, I did go in more. So I like to use Ann Budd's basic handy knitting book. I'll mention it in the show notes. For kind of my basic idea of how I'm going to approach the yoke, I just use math for the body, but then with the arm side, I'll kind of look at her numbers. But what I did this time was I looked at her numbers and then I added a few more. So I bound off 8 and then 4, which is quite a bit. So that's almost 2 inches, and that's on each piece. And then I decreased a little bit more up here. So my shoulder strap actually comes in. Here's my actual shoulder, and here's where the shoulder body wants to sit. But I think that that looks good. I'd rather have the shoulder sit in a little, and I don't know if that's because I have broader shoulders and just personal preference or what, but I don't like it when the shoulder band is like here. That looks like it's starting to fall off to me. So that's just something else that I did. And I didn't even look at her directions for the sleeve cap. Instead, I looked at the sleeve cap directions from a custom fit sweater, the Phryne one, that I had bought a couple years ago because I was also at around 7.5 stitches to the inch for that pattern. And then because I knew I wanted to do the pleat, I worked backwards to figure out a different decrease pattern in this section. Because this is, just the gradual decreases, so I don't think the shape matters as much, whereas at the very beginning and then up here, having that shape is more important. At least that was my theory, and it seamed in really easily, so it must have worked. And that is the Autumn in the Shire sweater. All these details will not be on the project page just because they're a bit random. But I will have a few details up on there in case you want to knit one of your own. It's a pretty easy project. If you wanted to, you could just follow the Ann Budd arm side for both the sleeve cap and the body, and you would end up with a sweater that fits. It's just a question of customizing, basically. So, on to works in progress. I've got 2. The first are a pair of socks. I've knit one of them, and I am on the leg of the second one. And these are for my boyfriend. It's the first pair of socks that I'm knitting him. So I wanted to knit quite simple socks. These are just 3x1 rib. And I had him try them on as I went. And I did end up having to pull back and add more decreases to the gusset because he wears like a size 10.5 to 11, but he likes a really snug sock. So he ended up wanting me to decrease down to 64 stitches for the body, whereas the leg is on 68 stitches because he's got a pretty high instep to get over his heel. Speaking of high instep, I did a heel flap and gusset because of that. Now this yarn is variegated, so it does change a little bit where the instep and gusset is, but Joel said he did not mind that. So I just think that the fit is so much better than a short row heel if you have a higher arch, and I really wanted him to get the best fitting pair of socks possible so that he will enjoy hand knit socks and want more. This is also Knit Pick Stroll. The solid is the grass left over from the pair of socks I knit for a friend, and the variegated is Evergreen Tonal, which Joel picked out for himself because green is one of his favorite colors. So these are just my socializing, relaxing knitting right now. Oh, and the cuff is just 1x1 twisted rib. And then the toe is the My Favorite Toe from a Knitty article by Kate Atherley that has a staggered decrease pattern, so it makes a nice round toe. And wow, that was a quick thing to talk about. And finally, for works in progress, I have rose mittens, which I'm knitting for me. And I finished the first one except for the converting and ends weaving in, but here it is. And there's the thumb, and the white yarn is the waist yarn, and that's where I'll convert it. So these are a scrappy project. I've been trying really hard to knit with more colors in different projects, and I always fail miserably because I always approach my knitting from a wardrobe perspective, and the solid colors just seem more mixable unless I'm doing very elaborate color work. So, but you might recognize these two yarns because I showed them in a Schrödinger. I think I pronounced that right. I got a Dutch friend to pronounce it for me, but it's been a few weeks. So anyway, segment with a teal yarn, and I was trying to decide what to do with them. And I still was a little indecisive. Meanwhile, I knew that I wanted to knit mittens out of this, which is left over from a hat I knit, and I like having matching hat and mitten sets. And I dyed this myself. It's West Yorkshire Spinners Jacob DK, just in the natural colorway, and I overdyed it. And so I decided that all of these three would make some really pretty pink mittens. and since I've got hats in this one and this one, and I've got enough yarn to knit myself another hat out of this, as well as I've got a cowl out of this, it just made sense to me that these mittens could go with a lot of different hat choices. So now, when I'm knitting essentially worsted weight mittens, I know that this one is classified as a DK, but it's sturdy, and I was holding the sport weight double. I need about a 48 stitch mitten, and that's really difficult to find on Ravelry. However, if you remember, I got very interested in the Garland Mitten Advent Calendar, which is a free pattern where you knit 24 tiny little mittens, and they're all so cute. But I also know that the likelihood of me knitting them is very small. But when I was looking at them, I noticed that the charts are all 48 stitches. So I thought, oh, I can use those charts to knit regular size mittens in worsted weight, which is exciting because that's my favorite weight for mittens. To be fair, I've never knit a pair of fingering weight mittens, but I kind of feel like if it's cold enough for these, I want like a thick fabric. I don't know. It gets cold where I am. And so I looked at the different designs, and since I wanted something that felt scrappy, I ended up going with mitten number 19 because it had just these kinds of random patterns. And part of me is very twitchy at the randomness, like it's not what I would have put together myself. But when I look at the details, I'm like, but why? But then when I look at it as a whole, I really enjoy it. So I'm glad that I went with it. The pattern includes a gusset thumb, but I just did an afterthought peasant thumb, I think is what it's called, because I find that fits me perfectly fine in the worsted weight mittens. If I was doing fingering weight, fingerless mitts, I would do a proper gusset, but for me, it doesn't seem to matter in this context. And it's easier because then you don't have to make it fit in with the color work. Because I did add a couple stitches just to make it so that it went in the round. Obviously, I left out the number, and I just did a ribbed cuff instead of the corrugated rib, because this yarn is by far the softest of the three, and my wrists are very sensitive, so I didn't want to be itchy down there. And what else? I got to here, and I realized that my mittens were knitting up longer, and that I have quite short hands, So I ended up cutting out a couple bands, essentially, of the pattern and jumping straight to the decreases, but I think that worked out well. So I'm really pleased with this. I would definitely use more of those charts because they're all beautiful to knit more mittens, and I'm sure that this size would also fit my mom, so that's really nice. And yeah. So that is my other work in progress. I have started the second one, but I haven't gotten very far into it. I started this to keep myself from going crazy last Friday when I was arguing with FedEx about a package that needed to be delivered urgently, and they were giving me the runaround. But it ended well, and now I have a mitten out of it. So the last thing I'm going to share today is my kind of knitting backstory. So as a child, I learned to crochet. It took me 3 tries. My mom knew how to crochet the basics, and she tried to show me, and the first couple times I got too frustrated and just threw it across the room because I had a temper. And then the third time it took, and I was around 9, and I got really into it, and I was born in 1986, so these are the mid-90s, before things like YouTube. So I checked out some books from the library, and with crochet, it's just different from knitting as far as the different stitches go, but I had a couple stitch dictionaries that I also inherited. My grandma gave them to me when her mother died because no one else crocheted. And so I used those and happily crocheted all the way through middle school, really. And then I'm not really sure why I stopped well, yes I am. So we moved between 9th and 10th grade, and my new high school was much more rigorous, so I didn't have as much time to crochet, and I also joined the debate team, so that took even more time, so basically it was just a time thing. And then I tried to pick up crocheting again after college, but by that point I had started to develop my chronic illnesses, and I couldn't crochet without experiencing a lot of pain in my forearms and wrists, and that's because I crochet like this. I'm sure that there's a better way to crochet, and I also am a very tight crocheter, so it was just really hard on my hands. So I had to stop for that reason. So I guess that's my crochet backstory. Meanwhile, knitting. So when I was 13, one of my best friends was Norwegian, and his mom knit, and she offered to show me how to knit. So in addition to inheriting crochet things from my great-grandmother, I had also inherited a bag with knitting needles and accessories and that kind of thing. So she taught me how to do the long tail cast on and knit and purl, and the purling was the Norwegian style, where the yarn is still at the back and it's like this swirly thing. It looks like a magic trick, but also a little tricky on the wrists. And I tried it, but because I was such a tight crocheter, I was also a really tight knitter, and that made it was almost impossible for me to get the second needle into a stitch, and I was using acrylic yarn at the time, and it would squeak on the metal needles, and it was not an enjoyable experience. So I did not get into knitting then. So then, when I was around 22, 23, I found knitting blogs, and they made it seem so appealing. So I tried to get into knitting again. This time I went to a local yarn shop. I was in Colorado at the time, and I was still using the metal needles, and, well, no, I bought myself a circular needle because I wanted to knit a hat. And I did knit the hat. It was a mock cable hat, so it had passed the stitch over, and I was literally picking it up with my fingers. I didn't realize you could pick it up with the needle. And once again, I was just such a tight knitter that it was not an enjoyable experience. So I knit a hat for me, I knit a hat for my sister, and then I stopped knitting again. And finally, when I was 27, I was reading a book about rheumatoid arthritis, and it said that knitting can be good for the arthritis. And during that time, my hands had deteriorated really rapidly. And so I was afraid at that point to try to pick up any kind of handcraft because I didn't want to make it worse, even though I was reading crafting blogs. So I decided to try knitting again, and I went to a local yarn store, and I decided I wanted to knit socks, so I bought myself a set of DPNs and a skein of Barocco Ultra Alpaca Fine sock yarn because it was the cheapest in the colors I wanted. And I got Wendy Johnson socks from the toe up from the library, and I knit a sock. and it took a really long time. I think I knit like 5 heels. I did the short row toe and heel because they were the same, so I figured that would be a little easier. And yeah, so, and then I knit the second one, but by that point I had been really working on getting my tension looser so that it was better for my hands. So then the second sock was too big, so I had to go back to the yarn store and buy a smaller set of DPNs and re-knit the second sock. But at that point I had very little money, and I had enough time, and I didn't think of socks as something that should be knit quickly, so it really didn't bother me that it took that long, and I was so proud of myself, and I finished it, and I enjoyed taking photos along the way because at the time photography was my main creative outlet. So I would say that it took about a year between that sock for me to knit a little more, and also I knew quite early on that I wanted Diet Craft needles, but there was a really long waiting list for them at the time, so I put myself on the waiting list, and it ended up taking, I think, 8 months. They came in right around my birthday, which was nice. But in the meantime, I didn't want to buy any other size needles because I knew that I would eventually have an interchangeable circular set and a DPN set. So I only knit socks because I had my size zeros, and then hats because I had that size 7 circular needle, as well as some metal DPNs from my great grandma. But at that point I was like, oh well, knitting in the round must just be easier, so I wasn't going to do flat knitting. Yeah, and all of my early projects were complicated. I didn't knit anything that was plain stockinette for over a year. I was amazed at how quickly stockinette went once I finally knit a little baby vest. So for me, knitting was supposed to be complicated, and it was supposed to take a long time, but it was also really fun and interesting, and that's how I got into knitting. So I definitely was very much benefited from having a library with an extensive knitting collection. They even had Elizabeth Zimmerman DVDs. So very early in my knitting, I got to sit there and watch Elizabeth as she knit, and I was so amazed that she could feel when a stitch got twisted because she's looking at the camera and not her knitting. And so her kind of very relaxed, you're the boss of your knitting, math is your friend kind of approach became my approach just because that's what I was exposed to first. So hopefully that is useful, as far as, or at least interesting, I guess more interesting than useful, my backstory. And that's why when people ask if a pattern is too complicated for beginners, I'm never really sure what answer to give, because it's more a question of how much time and mental energy are you willing to put in as a beginner, and how okay are you with frogging and ripping. And also learning how to drop down and fix mistakes, because, I mean, if you know how to knit and purl and yarn over, you can do most patterns. It's just going to take you longer, and you might have to redo some of it. So, it's been so nice to spend some time with you. I really appreciate that you came here and hopefully knit while I was chatting with you, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye!